Berlin, January 1943. Snow drifts against the windows of the Reich Chancellery. Inside, the air smells of tobacco, sweat, and paper. German officers crowd around a long oak table, maps stretched across it, red pins marking half of Europe. Adolf Hitler listens silently as Albert Speer reports on production numbers. Tanks, aircraft, U-boats, all rising. The Führer nods, satisfied. The Reich, he mutters, is untouchable. An adjutant places a fresh intelligence report on the table. It mentions American factories, Ford, Boeing, Bethlehem Steel, a nation once building cars and refrigerators, now turning out tanks and planes. The officers laugh. How can factory workers defeat the Wehrmacht? One scoffs. They build toys, not weapons. Thousands of miles away, night falls over Detroit. The glow of steel furnaces paints the horizon orange. Sparks rain from welding torches as women in overalls rivet the skin of a bomber's wing. Conveyors hum, engines roar. By dawn, another 100 tanks roll from the line. By week's end, another carrier sails from the shipyard. And while Berlin sleeps in confidence, the arsenal of democracy is awakening, a machine so vast and relentless that in time it will bury the arrogance of the Reich beneath mountains of steel and fire. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, Germany appeared unstoppable. In less than 2 years, the Wehrmacht had conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France. Nations that had taken centuries to build were overrun in weeks. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, seemed to validate everything Hitler had promised. Behind that success lay a philosophy: precision, engineering, and central control. German weapons were built to be the best, the most advanced tanks, the most accurate artillery, the most disciplined soldiers. Quality was their creed. Quantity, they believed, was for the weak. The Reich's industrial elite, Krupp, Messerschmitt, and Henkel, prided themselves on craftsmanship. Every tank that rolled out of the factory was a masterpiece of steel and skill. But masterpieces take time, and time in war is an enemy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood in uneasy peace. The Great Depression had left scars. Factories were quiet, men unemployed, industries idle. When Hitler's armies began their march, many Americans looked inward, reluctant to be drawn into another European war. But Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what was coming. As early as 1940, he called on America to become the arsenal of democracy. He promised to arm not only the United States, but the free nations of the world. At first, few took him seriously. Even within Germany, the notion seemed absurd. American factories were seen as chaotic, inefficient, filled with untrained labor and capitalist excess. To German planners, the United States was a nation of consumers, not warriors. And on paper, they were right. In 1939, Germany's war production dwarfed America's. The U.S. had barely 1,800 military aircraft. Germany had over 8,000. The Wehrmacht possessed thousands of tanks. The U.S. Army, fewer than 500. To the Reich, the equation was simple. America could not mobilize fast enough to matter. But beneath that calm surface, a storm was forming. As Germany tightened its grip on Europe, Roosevelt's administration quietly retooled American industry. Civilian plants were converted to military production. Automobile lines now turned out aircraft engines, and refrigerator companies made machine gun parts. The government poured billions into shipyards, airfields, and research. By 1941, the transformation was accelerating. Yet Berlin remained blind to it. Nazi intelligence reported America's mobilization as slow and disorganized. They saw statistics, not momentum. In truth, what was unfolding across the U.S. was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't just a military buildup. It was an industrial revolution on a national scale. The scale of American resources was beyond comprehension. The country spanned a continent, rich in coal, oil, iron, and labor. Factories stretched from Detroit to Seattle, from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles. And unlike war-torn Europe, American cities were untouched by bombs. Still, in 1940 and 1941, few believed those resources could be harnessed in time. Even within the U.S., there was skepticism. But everything changed after one day, December 7th, 1941. When Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor, the illusion of distance vanished. The sleeping giant awoke. Factories that once built cars now produced tanks by the hundreds. Shipyards that built merchant vessels now launched aircraft carriers every month. Women entered the workforce by the millions, filling the void left by men who went to fight. And while Germany was perfecting its engineering masterpieces, America was building an army of machines, not for elegance, but for endurance. The lines had been drawn. One nation obsessed with perfection, another obsessed with production. The clash between them would soon decide the fate of the modern world.
By early 1942, the United States was no longer the unarmed giant that Germany had mocked. Factories ran day and night. The clang of steel and the roar of machinery became the heartbeat of a nation at war. America didn't just mobilize, it re-engineered the very idea of mass production. The automobile industry, led by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, became the backbone of the military effort. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was the crown jewel, the largest factory in the world built for one purpose: to produce the B-24 Liberator bomber. Every 63 minutes, a fully functional bomber rolled off the assembly line. It was the first time in history that aircraft, complex thousand-part machines, were built like cars. To Germany, this was unthinkable. Their factories relied on skilled craftsmen and small batches. America relied on speed, repetition, and numbers. And it wasn't just planes. Tank production surged at an unimaginable pace. Detroit's arsenal of democracy turned out one new tank every 20 minutes. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more armored vehicles in a single month than Germany did in an entire year. The shipyards followed the same rhythm. When Allied convoys were being torn apart by German U-boats in the Atlantic, the U.S. Maritime Commission responded with the Liberty ship, a simple, rugged cargo vessel that could be built fast and cheap. The first ones took 230 days to complete. By 1943, shipyards were launching them in less than a week. At one point, America was launching 2 ships for every one that was sunk. For the German Kriegsmarine, that statistic was terrifying. Even the skies reflected this transformation. The U.S. Air Force grew from a few thousand planes to over 300,000 aircraft by war's end. Factories in California, Texas, and New York worked around the clock. Women, the Rosies of the home front, riveted metal and assembled engines with precision and pride. The scale was unprecedented. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 1.5 million military trucks, over 6,000 naval ships. Germany, despite its efficiency, couldn't keep up. The Reich lacked raw materials, suffered constant bombing, and relied on forced labor. American factories, meanwhile, grew stronger each month, unbombed, well-fed, and motivated by a shared sense of purpose. By late 1942, reports reaching Berlin painted a grim picture. German military attachés began noting the flood of Allied material arriving in Britain, North Africa, and the Pacific. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance flights over British ports revealed row after row of Liberty ships, cargo vessels, and troop transports, all bearing the same symbol, Made in the USA. In secret meetings, German officers began to whisper, "If the Americans can build faster than we can destroy, then how can we win?" But Hitler refused to believe it. He mocked Roosevelt's assembly line army, convinced that American soldiers, like their weapons, were mass-produced and inferior. He doubled down on expensive wonder weapons, the V-2 rockets, the Tiger tanks, the jet fighters, marvels of design, but impossible to produce in numbers that mattered. Meanwhile, in Washington and Detroit, efficiency became religion. Every factory adopted new production systems driven by data, schedules, and coordination between industries. America's war machine became a living organism fed by 16 million men and women working in perfect sync. The result was not just industrial might, it was psychological warfare. When German soldiers captured Allied equipment in North Africa, they were astonished by the sheer quantity of spare parts, ration packs, and fuel reserves. Their armies were constantly short of supplies. The Americans seemed to have endless reserves. By 1943, the myth of German industrial superiority was collapsing. Even Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, privately admitted, "The Americans are producing more than we ever thought possible. Their factories are a weapon more powerful than any tank or bomber." The tide of war was turning, not just on the battlefield, but on the production line. And soon, Germany would see the devastating consequences of underestimating America's industrial strength in the skies over Europe and on the beaches of Normandy.
The myth of German industrial supremacy. Before 1942, the world believed in the German machine. Precision, discipline, and technical mastery, these words defined the Reich's reputation. Nazi propaganda loved to boast that German engineering was unmatched. But this reputation hid a deep structural flaw. German factories were optimized for craftsmanship, not volume. They built exceptional tanks, but they built few. They made powerful aircraft, but in limited runs. Each Tiger tank that rolled off the line was a masterpiece, but for every Tiger, America could roll out 10 Shermans. The German system thrived on perfectionism, on the obsession that every bolt must fit exactly. The American system thrived on standardization, interchangeable parts, easy repairs, mass replication. When U.S. tanks broke down, spare parts were always available. When German tanks broke down, the entire vehicle often had to be replaced. The result? Germany's armored divisions, though deadly, were constantly shrinking. Meanwhile, Allied tank units could lose dozens in a battle and replace them within weeks. What Germany saw as superior engineering was, in the brutal arithmetic of war, a deadly inefficiency. And that inefficiency would soon prove fatal. The assembly line as a weapon. America didn't just outproduce Germany, it revolutionized how war was fought. The same principles that made Detroit's cars affordable now built machines of war. At the Ford Willow Run plant, a single assembly line stretched for over a mile. Thousands of workers, many of them women, moved in rhythm. Riveters, welders, inspectors, each performing one small task, perfectly timed. The sound was deafening. Metal clanging, engines roaring, human energy fused with mechanical precision. It was warfare turned into a science of movement.
Ford's engineers calculated production speed like generals planned offensives. Every minute wasted was an enemy gain. Every delay was a potential life lost overseas. By 1943, the system reached near perfection. The plant produced 650 bombers a month, one every hour, each capable of flying thousands of miles to strike Axis targets. The Germans simply couldn't match this tempo. Their factories relied on manual labor, fragmented supply chains, and constant Allied bombings. They built war machines like artisans. The Americans built them like a symphony. And that symphony would soon drown out the sound of German industry forever. Women, work, and the arsenal of democracy. While German factories turned to forced labor, prisoners, civilians, and conscripts, America turned to something far more powerful: its people. When millions of men left for war, women stepped into the factories. They became welders, riveters, and engineers, the silent army behind the front lines. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster, she was a symbol of total national unity. In one photograph, a young woman in overalls leans over a bomber wing, sparks flying from her torch. In another, a group of women test-fly aircraft they helped build. They were ordinary citizens creating extraordinary results. By 1944, women made up more than one-third of America's industrial workforce. Their precision matched any craftsman's. Their endurance outlasted expectations. And their spirit fueled a production miracle the world had never seen before. Germany never had an equivalent. Its war economy was controlled, hierarchical, and dependent on exploitation. America's was dynamic, innovative, and deeply human. This difference between coercion and collaboration became one of the greatest unseen weapons of the war. Logistics, the power behind the front. German commanders often mocked America's obsession with logistics. To them, it seemed overcomplicated: endless trucks, supply depots, and fuel drums. They prided themselves on blitzkrieg, swift, elegant, decisive. But by 1943, they realized logistics won wars. Every American offensive was backed by a tidal wave of supplies. A single U.S. infantry division in Europe consumed over 600 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, spare parts, fuel, uniforms. And the Americans delivered it every single day. Allies built entire harbors from scratch, known as Mulberry Harbors, to unload thousands of tons of cargo onto French beaches after D-Day. Germany, by contrast, struggled to keep its armies fed and fueled as Allied bombers destroyed their transport networks. Even before a battle began, America's logistical dominance decided its outcome. Behind every tank was a factory. Behind every factory, a train. Behind every train, a citizen who believed the work mattered. This invisible chain, from worker to warrior, is what Germany never understood until it was too late. The German generals had underestimated more than machines. They had underestimated a society of production, a society that could turn its collective strength into steel, wings, and ships faster than any empire in history. And soon, that strength would manifest in the turning points of the war: in North Africa, in Italy, and finally, in Normandy.
The Sky Factories, America's Air Power Revolution. By 1944, the sky itself had become an American factory floor. The U.S. Army Air Forces, supplied by endless production, could field thousands of bombers at once, a level of air power the world had never imagined possible. In Germany, Luftwaffe commanders were stunned as their radar screens lit up, wave after wave of American B-17s and B-24s stretching horizon to horizon. It wasn't just the size of the formations, it was their replacement rate. Every time Germany shot down 100 bombers, America built 200 more. Factories like Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in San Diego, and Douglas in Tulsa ran day and night, pouring aluminum, sweat, and willpower into the sky. By mid-1944, the Allies had 12 times more combat aircraft than Germany. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than they could be trained, while America replaced its air crews with trained men and machines on a constant rotation. The German skies, once ruled by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, were now dominated by American thunder. The flying fortresses didn't just bomb factories, they symbolized factories themselves, flying monuments to industrial might. Each bomber was a message to Berlin: you cannot shoot faster than we can build. The Sea of Steel. Shipyards that dwarfed empires. If America's air production shocked the Germans, its shipbuilding utterly terrified them. The United States had turned its coastlines into vast iron forests. Shipyards from New York to Los Angeles worked around the clock. Where once it took months to build a single vessel, engineers like Henry Kaiser introduced modular assembly, prefabricating entire sections and welding them together in record time. The Liberty ships became icons of this miracle. Simple, rugged, and mass-produced, they could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across oceans. At the height of production, one Liberty ship was completed every 3 days. In one extraordinary feat, the Robert E. Peary was assembled and launched in just under 5 days. Germany's U-boat captains soon faced an impossible reality. For every ship they sank, America built 5 more. Convoys grew larger, escorts stronger, and the Atlantic, once a hunting ground for submarines, turned into a highway of steel and victory. This maritime wave didn't just supply the front lines, it connected an entire world. From Alaska to Australia, from London to Leningrad, American-built ships delivered food, fuel, and freedom. For a nation that had once mocked America's floating factories, Germany now realized it was fighting a navy that could manufacture entire oceans. The psychological shock, when confidence turned to fear. The breaking point came not on the battlefield, but in the minds of German leaders. By late 1943, intelligence reports painted a horrifying picture. The United States had outproduced Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, was among the first to grasp the full scale of the disaster. He privately admitted that the Allies' material advantage was beyond comprehension. Even if every German worker labored to exhaustion, the Reich could not close the gap. Hitler refused to believe it. He dismissed reports as propaganda, insisting that German quality would triumph over American quantity. But quality cannot fly when there's no fuel. It cannot shoot when there's no steel. It cannot win when the enemy replaces every loss in days, while you count every tank like gold. As Allied troops advanced, captured German officers spoke with disbelief. "How is it possible," asked one, "that you have more tanks than we have bullets?" That was the true terror. The realization that they were not just fighting soldiers, but an entire civilization mobilized for war. By 1944, the illusion of German industrial superiority had collapsed. The Reich had entered the war believing its machines were unmatched. It would end the war surrounded by the proof that machines alone cannot defeat a nation united in purpose. And that purpose, forged in factories, powered by democracy, and driven by sheer will, would soon reach its crescendo in the battles that shattered the Nazi war machine once and for all.
North Africa, November 1942. The desert wind carries dust and diesel fumes as American M4 Shermans rumble across the dunes. The Germans, battle-hardened veterans under Rommel, watch in disbelief. The tanks keep coming. Columns stretch to the horizon. At first, The Africa Corps laughs. They've seen American equipment before. Undertrained crews, clumsy tactics. Easy prey. But this time, it's different. For every tank destroyed, 2 more arrive. For every truck lost, another convoy replaces it within days. Rommel radios Berlin in frustration. "The Americans," he writes, "replace faster than we can destroy." It's the first glimpse of what Germany would come to dread: industrial warfare on a scale beyond imagination. By the end of Operation Torch, the Allies had landed 850 ships, 300,000 men, and over 1,000 tanks across North Africa. The German supply lines, thin and brittle, could barely deliver fuel to the front. The American supply chain, by contrast, was a living organism, constant, precise, and endless. Every bullet fired in Tunisia, every ration eaten under desert sun could be traced back to a factory worker in Ohio or a welder in Kansas. This was not just strategy, it was systemic dominance. Germany could win battles, but America could win wars, simply because it could keep fighting when others could not. June 1944, D-Day, Normandy. At dawn, the horizon itself seemed to move. Over 7,000 Allied ships filled the sea. The German coastal defenders stared in stunned silence, a metallic armada stretching beyond sight. Landing craft slammed against the beaches, unloading tanks, jeeps, bulldozers, trucks, and soldiers in an endless flood. Behind them, engineers brought portable harbors, mulberries, to turn open beaches into functional ports within days. In the sky, bombers thundered overhead, tens of thousands of aircraft, escorted by fighters, each built in American plants that never slept. German field commanders were paralyzed. Their intelligence reports had warned of a landing, but nothing like this. One officer at Omaha Beach later wrote, "We thought we were fighting an army. Instead, we were fighting a continent." For every German division stationed in France, America's factories had already built enough to equip 10 more. By the time the beaches were secured, the Allies had landed over 156,000 men, and within a month, more than 1 million. Every man fed, every gun supplied, every vehicle fueled. The numbers defied comprehension, but they were real and they were relentless. Germany had built one of the greatest military machines in history, but now that machine was being crushed beneath something far greater, an industrial avalanche. The Strategic Bombing Campaign. Even as the Allies stormed Europe, the skies over Germany burned nightly. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched raids of unprecedented scale, sometimes 1,000 bombers in a single day. Factories in Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, the pride of German industry, were reduced to rubble. Speer and his engineers worked feverishly to disperse production underground, but it was too late. American bombers flew with near impunity, protected by swarms of long-range P-51 Mustangs. And for every bomber lost, another rolled off the assembly line back home. Germany tried to retaliate with jet fighters and V-weapons, desperate signs of innovation, but innovation without production was futile. The Reich simply couldn't build enough to matter. Each raid cost Germany more fuel, more steel, more workers, resources it could never replenish. Each raid brought the war closer to its industrial heart. And as the flames lit the night sky over the Ruhr Valley, German officers began to whisper the truth no one dared speak aloud. The war was already lost. The Reich had entered the conflict believing that victory lay in discipline, technology, and willpower. But in the age of total war,
Victory belonged to those who could produce faster, longer, and larger than anyone else. By the summer of 1944, America's industrial might was no longer a background factor. It was the decisive weapon. The tanks in France, the ships in the Channel, the bombers over Berlin, all of them were pieces of a single, vast machine. A machine that never tired, never paused, never ran out.
Autumn 1944, Berlin. The once proud capital of the Reich trembles under the thunder of distant explosions. Air raid sirens wail almost daily. The lights of the city, dimmed to hide from bombers, flicker like dying embers. In the Ministry of Armaments, Albert Speer stands before a wall of production charts. Red lines climb and then fall, again and again. Bombings, shortages, factory relocations. Each line tells the same story: collapse. Across the Atlantic, American production lines show the opposite: steady, upward, unstoppable. By 1944, U.S. factories were producing 96,000 aircraft, 17 million tons of shipping, and 29,000 tanks annually. Germany, under siege and starving for resources, produced less than a quarter of that. Speer knew the math. He once wrote, "The war was decided by the superiority of American industry and the bravery of Russian soldiers." And by the end of 1944, even Hitler's most loyal generals could no longer deny it. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. It was Germany's last gamble, a desperate attempt to shatter the Allied front and force a truce. The plan depended on surprise, weather, and the hope that America's will would crack under pressure. For a moment, it worked. German panzers broke through the Ardennes. American lines faltered. Chaos spread across the snow-covered forests of Belgium. But then the blizzard lifted, and the skies filled with American planes. Wave after wave of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Marauders roared in, cutting off fuel convoys, blasting roads, isolating German armor. The offensive slowed, then stopped. By January 1945, the German army had lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks, and any chance of recovery. But what truly broke their spirit wasn't the defeat. It was the speed of the Allied response. Within weeks, fresh American units, fully supplied and rearmed, filled the front again. Germany's generals could barely comprehend it. Their own armies took months to rebuild after a setback. The Americans seemed to regenerate overnight. "Everywhere we fought," one officer later recalled, "they came back stronger. It was as if their factories were right behind the front line." The home fronts compared. By 1945, the contrast between the two nations had become almost symbolic. In America, factories buzzed with confidence. Propaganda posters read, "More production, quicker victory." Children collected scrap metal. Communities held drives for rubber, copper, and aluminum. Hollywood stars urged citizens to buy war bonds. In Germany, factories ran on fear. Slave laborers toiled under guard, malnourished and desperate. Production goals were met through punishment, not pride. Cities burned, while trains full of workers vanished under Allied bombing raids. America's industrial war was collective and moral. Germany's was coercive and collapsing. Even Speer, the architect of Nazi armaments, understood that the foundation of America's success wasn't just its machines, it was its unity. Every American worker believed they were part of something greater. Every shift change, every welded plate, every rivet was an act of defiance against tyranny. April 1945, the collapse. The end came like the slow closing of a massive iron door. The Allies advanced from the west. The Soviets closed from the east. German fuel stocks were gone, aircraft grounded,
tanks abandoned for lack of parts. When Berlin finally fell, the Luftwaffe had fewer than 200 operational planes left to defend the Reich. America had 80,000. German generals, now prisoners, spoke with disbelief at their interrogations. How could we compete, one asked, against a country that builds faster than we can think? In the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, between the shattered walls and smoke, the myth of German industrial invincibility finally died. The same nation that had once laughed at American consumerism now faced annihilation by the very efficiency it mocked. The arsenal of democracy did what no army alone could. It had buried the Nazi Empire beneath mountains of American steel. As the last German factories went silent, the truth echoed across history. Wars are not only fought by soldiers, they are won by nations capable of endless renewal. And in World War II, no nation renewed itself faster, harder, and more completely than the United States of America.
When the dust finally settled over Europe and the Pacific, the results of America's industrial onslaught were visible everywhere, from the skies over Berlin to the harbors of Tokyo. Germany's mighty war machine, which had once thundered across Europe, now lay in ruins. Factories in the Ruhr were reduced to rubble. Rail lines, fuel depots, and assembly plants were nothing but twisted steel. Yet, across the Atlantic, American plants were still operating at full speed, producing not for survival anymore, but for victory and occupation. By the end of 1944, Germany's industrial output had collapsed by nearly 60%. The Luftwaffe was crippled by fuel shortages and lack of replacement aircraft. The Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Reich, were often sent into battle with only a handful of tanks. Entire units had to share spare parts, and ammunition trains were routinely bombed before they even reached the front. In contrast, the United States had achieved something no nation in history ever had: total war economy without total societal collapse. American factories had mastered a rhythm that turned production into a science of speed. In Detroit, Ford's Willow Run plant rolled out a new B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Across the Midwest, workers, men and women, immigrants and farmers, all wearing the same dusty coveralls, labored under the glow of fluorescent lights, welding the backbone of victory. From Kansas came bombers. From Pennsylvania came tanks. From California came ships. By 1945, the United States was building more than 50,000 aircraft annually, compared to Germany's 7,500. The Allies had outproduced the Axis in tanks by more than 10 to 1. For every ship Germany launched, America launched 50. This wasn't just industrial superiority. It was industrial domination on a civilizational scale. In Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, could only watch in grim admiration. His efforts to centralize and streamline Nazi industry came too late. In post-war interviews, Speer admitted, "The American production system was our greatest enemy. We could never match its organization or its scale." And behind those numbers were millions of workers. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of an economy mobilized by willpower. Women took over shipyards, airframe plants, and machine shops. African Americans, despite discrimination, filled critical roles in steel mills and foundries. America had turned its diversity into its deadliest weapon, a united, relentless industrial front. Meanwhile, on the German side, desperation took over. Civilians were melting down church bells for metal, school children were sent to salvage copper, and engineers were redesigning weapons to use less steel. Germany's economy had become a hollow engine, sputtering on fumes of nationalism and fear. Even as Allied bombers turned cities like Hamburg and Dresden into infernos, the regime still demanded miracles from a system that had already collapsed. The U.S. industrial miracle didn't just supply America,
It supplied the entire Allied world. The British Eighth Army marched with American trucks. Soviet tank divisions advanced using American fuel and jeeps. And French resistance fighters fought with American rifles parachuted from the sky. This web of steel and logistics became the invisible foundation of victory. No strategy, no battlefield brilliance could survive without fuel, bullets, and spare parts. And America provided all three in unthinkable abundance. By 1945, even Japan's commanders admitted that industrial strength, not just courage, had determined the war's outcome. As the war ended, the statistics told a story more powerful than any speech. 300,000 aircraft built, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 5,600 merchant ships, 8 million tons of bombs dropped, and over 16 million Americans who served, supported by 130 million who worked tirelessly at home. Germany gambled that America's democracy was too soft, too organized to fight a long war. But democracy had proven to be the most efficient war machine of all, precisely because it allowed its citizens to believe they were part of something greater. Factories that once made cars now built tanks. Assembly lines that once produced refrigerators now forged engines of war. Every rivet, every bullet, every crate shipped across the Atlantic carried with it a simple message: you cannot outlast America. And as the last German city surrendered, that message echoed not just across Europe, but across the entire world. The war had ended, but America's industrial awakening had only just begun.
When the guns fell silent in 1945, America stood alone atop a mountain of steel, oil, and production power. The same factories that had churned out tanks and bombers were now poised to rebuild a shattered world. Europe lay in ruins, its railways twisted, its cities hollowed, its people displaced by the tens of millions. Yet across the Atlantic, the United States emerged not weakened, but enormously strengthened. No nation in history had ever experienced such a transformation in so short a time. In 1940, America had ranked 18th in global military strength, behind nations like Portugal. By 1945, it had become an industrial colossus capable of supplying half the world's weapons, vehicles, and food. The war had not destroyed the U.S. economy, it had supercharged it. Unemployment had vanished. Technological innovation was exploding, and most crucially, the world's gold, fuel, and credit had flowed into American hands. Germany's defeat was not just a military collapse, it was the death of an idea. The Nazi regime had believed that war was won by force of will, by the superior race, and by the iron discipline of the few. America had proven that victory instead belonged to the many, the engineers, machinists, and welders who worked invisible battles on factory floors. The industrial miracle that overwhelmed Germany became the foundation of a new kind of global leadership. Through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars in American goods, machinery, and aid were sent back across the Atlantic, not as weapons this time, but as tools of reconstruction. The same ships that once carried tanks now carried tractors, food, and steel beams. In Germany, towns once reduced to ash began to hum with industry again, but now under a very different system. American trucks rumbled through Cologne and Frankfurt carrying supplies for rebuilding. American engineers taught German workers how to use assembly line systems inspired by Detroit. The irony was striking. The nation that had tried to destroy American industry was now being rebuilt by it. Meanwhile, in Japan, a similar transformation unfolded. Factories that had once built Zero fighters began producing radios, cameras, and automobiles with techniques refined during the American occupation. General Douglas MacArthur's administration restructured Japan's industrial core, paving the way for what would later become the Japanese economic miracle. Everywhere the U.S. extended its reach, its assembly line philosophy followed. Mass production became not just an American advantage, it became the new world order. But this newfound dominance came with responsibility.
The Cold War soon turned production into a new kind of competition. The same steel that once built tanks now forged missiles. The same factories that once made bombers now produced jet engines and nuclear submarines. America's industrial system, once mobilized for survival, had become the permanent machinery of global influence. For Germany, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. Its military genius had been real, but its economic vision had been narrow. The Nazi leadership had never truly understood that wars of the 20th century were not won by bravery alone or even by technology. They were won by sustainability, by the capacity to replace, repair, and resupply faster than the enemy could destroy. Historians would later point out that for every tank Germany built, America built 10. For every aircraft engine produced in the Reich, America made 20. And while German industry fought to keep pace, Allied factories were already designing the next generation of machines before the current ones even reached the front. This relentless rhythm of production changed everything. It altered how nations planned wars, how they structured economies, and how they viewed the link between science, industry, and national survival. From that moment on, every superpower, from the Soviet Union to China, would chase the same model America had perfected between 1941 and 1945, a nation as a factory. When Berlin finally surrendered, Hitler's war machine didn't just lose the battlefield, it lost the very industrial race that defined modern warfare. The Reich had run out of fuel, metal, and time. America, on the other hand, had an abundance of all three. And so, when the smoke cleared, one truth stood above all others. The Allies hadn't just defeated Germany's army, they had defeated its economy, its ideology, and its illusion of invincibility. What began as a contest of armies ended as a triumph of logistics. And from the ruins of that war, a new world was born, powered not by conquest, but by production. The Second World War was above all a war of endurance. It tested not just the courage of soldiers, but the capacity of nations, their ability to create, to rebuild, and to sustain destruction beyond imagination. And in that test, America redefined what it meant to be powerful. The German Reich had believed in the supremacy of will, that war could be won by brilliance, audacity, and speed. But America's triumph revealed a different truth, that the real power of a nation lies in its collective momentum, the silent unity of millions who build, forge, and ship without ever firing a shot. The story of America's industrial victory is not of luck or chance. It is the story of organization, innovation, and faith in scale, of women filling factory floors, of engineers redesigning tools overnight, of citizens investing in war bonds and believing with quiet determination that effort itself could be a weapon. By the end of the war, Germany's arrogance had turned into disbelief. What began as mockery, "America builds toys, not tanks," ended with surrender before a nation that had turned every toy factory into a fortress of industry. The ruins of Berlin stood as monuments not only to military defeat, but to an even deeper revelation, that the age of conquest by armies was ending and the age of conquest by production had begun. In the decades that followed, the same machine that had fueled the war would fuel prosperity. The assembly lines that once built bombers built cars for peace. The engineers who designed engines for destruction began creating technology for exploration. America's industrial spirit had not only won a war, it had laid the foundation for a global century. And as historians would later say, it was not just the soldier, nor the general, nor even the president who ensured victory. It was the worker, standing beneath the hum of a factory light, holding a wrench, building the weapon that would turn the tide. In the end, Germany's greatest miscalculation was not in its strategy, but in its underestimation of what a democracy could build when its people worked as one. Because power, it turned out, was not forged in ideology. It was forged in steel.